What if the first preacher of the resurrection was not a man, not Peter, not Paul, but a woman? And not just any woman, but one who remained standing while others fled. One whose name was spoken by the risen Christ before any other, and whose voice proclaimed the most important truth of Christianity. Her name was Mary of Magdala, and for nearly 2,000 years, her story has been buried beneath layers of distortion, myth, and strategic forgetting. But beneath those layers lies a witness, a leader, and perhaps the most important disciple of all. Before we go further, if this mystery already has your curiosity stirred, pause just a moment. Subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the revelations ahead. Comment below with where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. You'll be surprised by how many of us are uncovering these truths together across the globe. And if this story already resonates with you, if you feel you're beginning to understand why the title refers to a forbidden truth, share this video with someone who needs to hear the story history tried to erase. We find Mary Magdalene first in the Gospel of Luke, identified as a woman from whom 7 demons had been cast out. This phrase, often sensationalized, likely signified a profound healing, possibly emotional or psychological, that changed the trajectory of her life. Unlike many unnamed women in the Gospels, Mary is named repeatedly. More significantly, she is described as traveling with Jesus and supporting his ministry financially, alongside other women. In first-century Palestine, this was revolutionary. Women were rarely allowed to follow rabbis, much less fund their missions. Her inclusion in Jesus' inner circle suggests not only devotion, but agency. She wasn't simply a healed woman clinging to her Savior. She was a disciple in her own right. But Mary's true moment of transformation and revelation comes during the final days of Jesus' life. When the male disciples flee in fear, Mary remains. She stands at the foot of the cross. She watches the burial, and she rises early on the 3rd day to visit the tomb. She is, in all 4 canonical Gospels, present at the crucifixion and the resurrection, a distinction shared by no other follower. In the Gospel of John, she is alone when the risen Christ first appears. She doesn't recognize him at first, thinking he is the gardener until he speaks her name, Mary. That one word transforms everything. Her response, Rabboni, Aramaic for my teacher, reveals a relationship that was not casual. It suggests reverence, intimacy, and recognition. This encounter is not only personal, but theological. Jesus commissions her to go to my brothers and tell them he has risen. In that moment, she becomes the first messenger of the resurrection, the first evangelist. This commissioning is not symbolic. It is functional. She is sent. She is trusted. She is the apostle to the apostles. And yet, within a few generations, her role begins to diminish. Though she is never called a prostitute in any canonical gospel, centuries of tradition have rewritten her as one. Pope Gregory the Great's sermon in 591 CE conflated Mary Magdalene with both Mary of Bethany and the anonymous sinful woman who anoints Jesus' feet. This deliberate merging served a purpose. The Church could retain Mary Magdalene as a figure of redemption while stripping her of spiritual authority. Her identity became that of the reformed sinner, not the first apostle. The damage endured for over a millennium. Why was this done? Scholars suggest it was part of a broader movement to consolidate male authority in the early Church. As the Christian faith spread and organized itself into an institution, Roles for women were gradually restricted. Mary Magdalene, with her undeniable prominence in the resurrection story, posed a problem. If she had been the first to see Christ and the first to proclaim his rising, then why were women barred from leadership? The solution was to recast her, not as a teacher or prophet, but as a penitent, a woman saved not for her wisdom, but from her sin. Yet the texts themselves resist this manipulation. Every time we read the resurrection narratives with fresh eyes, Mary Magdalene reemerges, not as the fallen woman made good, but as the faithful one who never left. In a society where women's voices were silenced in court, hers was the one Jesus trusted with the news that he had overcome death. This was not an accident, it was a statement. The early church knew it. The Eastern Orthodox tradition remembered it, and now, modern scholarship is beginning to restore it. Context is everything. In first-century Galilee, for a woman to travel independently, engage with male disciples, and speak with religious authority was unheard of. That Mary Magdalene did all of these things, and was remembered for them, speaks volumes about the nature of the early Jesus movement. It was radical, inclusive, subversive. Mary's role was not a deviation, but a reflection of Jesus's inclusive vision. She was not simply tolerated, she was chosen. That choice, made by Jesus himself, calls into question centuries of ecclesiastical hierarchy built on male succession. If the resurrection, the foundation of Christian faith, was entrusted first to a woman, then what does that say about spiritual authority, about tradition, about truth? Today, as we uncover ancient manuscripts and reassess early Christian writings, Mary Magdalene's image is being reclaimed. Scholars note her frequency in the gospel texts, her leadership, and her courage. Archaeological evidence, including art and inscriptions, suggests that early Christian communities honored women leaders far more than previously acknowledged. The recovery of her legacy is not just about setting the record straight. It's about reclaiming a vision of Christianity that was more inclusive, more spiritually dynamic, and more human. We must ask, what else was lost when her story was changed? What wisdom, what teachings, what traditions vanished with her authority? The silencing of Mary Magdalene is not an isolated case. It is a lens through which we can view the development of institutional religion. Her story reminds us how easily authority can be reshaped, how stories can be rewritten, and how truth can be hidden behind doctrine. But her presence in the original texts remains like a whisper beneath the noise, a reminder that sometimes the most important stories survive not in the centers of power, but in the hearts of those who refuse to forget. We are only beginning to recover the full story of Mary Magdalene. The journey ahead will take us into hidden texts, ancient prophecies, and spiritual traditions that challenge everything we think we know. But before we go further, we must remember her not as the Church eventually made her, but as the Gospels first revealed her, present, steadfast, and chosen. Chosen not because she was perfect, but because she believed. Chosen not because of what she had done, but because of who she was. Mary Magdalene's voice may have echoed in the earliest days of Christianity, but in the centuries that followed, that voice was gradually muted, then distorted, until what remained was barely a shadow of the woman who stood at the heart of the resurrection story. Her transformation was not the result of ignorance or historical confusion alone. It was a deliberate act, a character assassination of theological precision and cultural convenience. executed by those who found her authority not just inconvenient, but threatening. It began slowly, with ambiguity. The New Testament never clearly defines Mary Magdalene's background beyond her healing and her faith. Yet in the Western tradition, especially by the late 4th and early 5th centuries, new interpretations began to blur her identity. Was she the woman who anointed Jesus' feet in the house of Simon the Pharisee? Was she the sister of Lazarus and Martha in Bethany? Or was she simply the once-possessed woman from Magdala? With no definitive answers and a growing desire for clarity and order in a rapidly institutionalizing church, someone made a decision. That someone was Pope Gregory I, known as Gregory the Great. In a sermon delivered in 591 CE, he did something that would define Mary Magdalene in the Western imagination for over 1,000 years. He merged 3 separate women in the Gospels into one. He declared that Mary of Magdala, Mary of Bethany, and the unnamed sinful woman in Luke were all the same person. This was not supported by the texts themselves, and scholars today overwhelmingly agree that the identities were distinct. But the damage was done. From that point forward, Mary Magdalene would be remembered not as a leader or witness, but as a prostitute turned penitent. A woman redeemed not for her faithfulness or insight, but for her remorse. Gregory's intentions may have been pastoral. He used the new narrative to underscore the power of repentance. But the effect was devastating. It erased her authority. It recast her spiritual legacy into a morality tale. It shifted her from the realm of apostolic power to the shadows of moral failure. And as the church grew in political and social influence, this shift served a larger purpose. It helped build a hierarchy where women were naturally subordinate. Their place in the church defined not by leadership, but by repentance, service, and silence. Yet the Eastern Church tells a different story. In Orthodox traditions, Mary Magdalene was never confused with the sinful woman. She was honored as Isapostolos, equal to the apostles. Icons depict her holding a red egg, a symbol of the resurrection, and proclaiming the risen Christ before emperors. In the East, she was never reduced to tears and sensuality. She remained a teacher, a preacher, a prophetic voice. The divergence between East and West is revealing. It shows that the West's recasting of Mary Magdalene was not inevitable. It was cultural and strategic. Why was the West so threatened by Mary's original identity? The answer lies in the broader transformation of the Church itself. By the 6th century, Christianity had become the state religion of the Roman Empire. With that status came structure, formality, and patriarchy. The spontaneous, spirit-led communities of the early Jesus movement gave way to rigid hierarchies. Bishops, priests, and councils emerged as the gatekeepers of orthodoxy. And in this newly defined structure, there was little room for a woman who had been the first to receive the risen Christ. So Mary's identity had to change, not just slightly, but fundamentally. She couldn't be both the apostle to the apostles and the model of sinful repentance. She couldn't represent authority and submission at once. So the version that survived was the one that supported the hierarchy being built, the version that could be sculpted into stone, painted in frescoes, and preached from pulpits without threatening male dominance. The transformation was not subtle. It was surgical. Art followed theology. Medieval Europe became saturated with images of Mary Magdalene as the penitent sinner, often semi-nude, weeping in a cave, her hair long and loose, clutching a skull or a crucifix. These images did not arise from the Gospels, but from the reimagined figure created by the institutional church. She was no longer a disciple, but an archetype, an allegory of fallen womanhood, useful for sermons on sin and redemption, but stripped of her historical identity. But history leaves traces. And as modern scholarship developed, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, researchers began to peel back the layers. Textual criticism revealed that the original Gospels never describe Mary as sexually immoral. Historical studies showed how her conflation with other figures had been manufactured. Feminist theologians asked why her story had been changed so drastically, and what that revealed about the Church's treatment of women more broadly. The character assassination of Mary Magdalene is one of the most effective and enduring examples of institutional narrative control in Western religious history. But it is not just a story about the past. It continues to shape how women are perceived in spiritual communities today. It continues to influence how authority, purity, and voice are assigned or denied based on gender. And recovering Mary's story is not just about historical correction. It is about reclaiming a spiritual lineage that was interrupted. Because beneath the layers of repentance and allegory lies a very different Mary. A woman who walked with Jesus. A woman who stood at the cross. A woman who proclaimed the resurrection. A woman who, for the first generations of Christians, embodied spiritual leadership and divine insight. And though her name was twisted and her legacy buried, the memory of her true identity was never entirely lost. It lived on in the margins, in apocryphal texts, in Eastern icons, in the whispers of those who never fully accepted the official version. Today, as scholars, believers, and seekers return to the earliest sources, Mary Magdalene is rising again, not from myth, but from history, not as a symbol of shame, but as a voice of truth. In the arid soil of Upper Egypt, beneath layers of sand that had lain undisturbed for over 15 centuries, a farmer named Muhammad al-Saman struck something hard while digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi. What he uncovered in 1945 was no ordinary object, but a sealed clay jar that would alter the course of religious scholarship. Inside were 13 leather-bound codices containing more than 50 ancient texts. These were not copies of the familiar Bible stories, but Gospels, revelations, and teachings that had been excluded, some deliberately, from the canon of Christianity. Among these was a fragmented yet extraordinary text, now known as the Gospel of Mary, and within its cryptic lines, the voice of Mary Magdalene, long silenced, began to speak again. The Gospel of Mary, though damaged and incomplete, immediately struck scholars for its radical difference from the canonical Gospels. It begins not with the birth or death of Jesus, but with a conversation among his disciples after his resurrection. Jesus has departed, and the disciples are confused and afraid. It is Mary, not Peter, not James, who comforts them, who offers understanding, and who recalls teachings she received privately from Jesus. This alone is stunning. A woman taking the lead in theological interpretation, guiding the very men whose authority would later define the church. But the text goes even further. When Peter questions whether Jesus would really have spoken to a woman in private and entrusted her with teachings hidden from the others, Mary responds with composure and clarity. She does not defend herself with emotion, but with the weight of wisdom. She recounts a vision of the soul's ascent, a mystical journey through layers of spiritual challenge, culminating in liberation from material bondage. The theology is complex, esoteric, and steeped in what scholars now identify as Gnostic thought, a movement that emphasized inner knowledge, gnosis, as the path to salvation. This was not the Mary of medieval penitence. This was a spiritual guide, a visionary, a theologian, and that revelation sent tremors through the academic world. If Mary Magdalene had been remembered in some early Christian communities as a recipient of private revelations from Jesus, what did that mean for the Church's insistence on a closed, male-dominated apostolic tradition? Other texts from the Nag Hammadi collection echoed this theme: the Gospel of Thomas, the Dialogue of the Savior, and the Pistis Sophia, though not all centered on Mary, described a Christianity that was diverse, mystical, and far less hierarchical than the institutional church would later become. In these texts, spiritual authority did not come through titles or succession, but through understanding, awakening, and experience, and again. Mary Magdalene appeared not on the periphery, but at the center, in the Gospel of Mary. The tension between Peter and Mary is particularly telling. He cannot accept that Jesus would favor her with secret teachings. His incredulity is not merely theological, it is personal. He is offended, not by her message, but by her position. This narrative reflects a very real tension that existed in early Christianity, a battle between differing visions of who could speak for Jesus, who could interpret his message, and who had the right to lead. What makes the Gospel of Mary even more compelling is its tone. Mary does not seek power. She does not argue for dominance. She teaches, she reveals, and then she disappears from the story. Her authority comes not from force, but from presence, from being the one who truly understood the teacher's heart. That kind of authority is more difficult to institutionalize. It cannot be transferred by ceremony or ordination. It can only be lived. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi texts came at a pivotal moment. The 20th century had already witnessed the rise of textual criticism, feminist theology, and growing skepticism toward rigid religious structures. Mary Magdalene's reemergence as a spiritual authority from ancient texts validated the sense that something profound had been lost in the official versions of Christian history. The Church had not simply forgotten her, it had edited her out. Why were these texts buried? The answer lies in history. By the 4th century, as Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire, diversity was no longer welcome. Unity was the goal. Unity of doctrine, practice, and authority. The Gnostic Gospels, with their emphasis on inner revelation and egalitarian leadership, posed a threat to this unity. And so they were condemned, burned, and in some cases, buried, hidden by monks or believers who could not bear to destroy them entirely, hoping perhaps that future generations would one day be ready to hear their message. That message is not simple. The Gospel of Mary does not offer easy answers. It does not present Mary as a romantic figure or a political revolutionary. It presents her as something far more unsettling to the Church that grew in her absence, a legitimate interpreter of Jesus' deepest teachings. Her voice in the text is clear, calm, and assured. She does not claim authority. She embodies it. The implications of this are enormous. If Mary Magdalene was remembered by early Christians as the one who received esoteric wisdom directly from Jesus, then the very structure of Christian authority comes into question. What if spiritual truth was never meant to be confined to councils and creeds? What if the first teacher of the resurrection was also the keeper of teachings that defied the institutions that came later. The Nag Hammadi texts, and the Gospel of Mary in particular, don't just rehabilitate Mary Magdalene's reputation, they challenge us to rethink the nature of revelation, the sources of spiritual wisdom, and the cost of excluding voices that don't conform to institutional power. More than 70 years have passed since those codices were unearthed in Egypt. In that time, the world has changed, and the questions they raise have only grown more urgent. Who gets to speak for faith? Who gets to lead? And what truths remain hidden, not because they are false, but because they are dangerous? Mary Magdalene's voice, long buried, now speaks again, not only through ancient papyrus, but through scholars, artists, seekers, and believers who are ready to hear what was once forbidden. She speaks of a faith that is personal, experiential, and unbound by hierarchy. She speaks of a Christ who trusted her with wisdom the others could not grasp. She speaks of a world where truth is not limited by gender, power, or dogma. And perhaps most of all, she reminds us that buried truth is never lost. It waits, like the scrolls beneath the sand, for the moment when the world is ready to listen. Among the fragments recovered from the sands of Egypt in the Nag Hammadi discovery, one text stands out for its enigmatic and controversial portrayal of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip. This Gospel, written in Coptic and believed to have originated in the 2nd or 3rd century, does not read like a traditional narrative. It is a patchwork of sayings, theological reflections, and mystical teachings. But within its cryptic lines lies one of the most hotly debated passages in all of Christian scholarship. A statement that Jesus loved Mary Magdalene more than the other disciples and used to kiss her often. For some, this is evidence of a romantic relationship. For others, it is something deeper, more spiritual, and perhaps even more revolutionary. The Greek word used to describe Mary in this gospel is koinonos, often translated as companion, but the term is rich with meaning. It can refer to a partner in a business, a spouse in a marriage, or a fellow initiate in a spiritual journey. The ambiguity has fueled speculation, both academic and sensational. Was Mary Jesus' wife, his lover, or was she his closest spiritual confidant, bound to him not by flesh, but by wisdom? To understand the passage in context, we must step back into the cultural world of the early Christian communities. In ancient Mediterranean societies, spiritual companionship was a recognized concept. Teachers often had disciples with whom they shared not only instruction, but a profound sense of union, intellectual, emotional, and mystical. In some Jewish and Greek philosophical traditions, this type of bond was seen as essential for the transmission of sacred knowledge. It was believed that divine truth could only be passed through deep relational intimacy, a kind of soul-to-soul recognition that transcended words. If Jesus and Mary Magdalene shared such a bond, it would not have been scandalous in spiritual terms, but it would have upended social conventions, especially in a patriarchal culture that viewed women as subordinate. The Gospel of Philip presents Mary Magdalene not just as beloved, but as someone chosen for insight. In one heavily fragmented passage, the other disciples express jealousy and protest Jesus' closeness to her. Peter, once again, objects. He cannot comprehend why Jesus would elevate a woman above them. This tension echoes what we saw in the Gospel of Mary and confirms that some early communities viewed Mary not merely as a disciple, but as the disciple. Her access to Jesus was not just emotional, It was theological. She understood things the others did not. But what was the nature of this special love? Modern scholars have urged caution against reading modern assumptions into ancient texts. The word kiss in the Gospel of Philip may not be about eroticism. In many Gnostic and early Christian traditions, the kiss was a symbol of spiritual transmission, a gesture of unity and recognition. The holy kiss was a common greeting in early churches, a sign of peace and shared truth. If Jesus kissed Mary Magdalene, it may have meant he was giving her something sacred: knowledge, affirmation, initiation. The emotional energy of the text is undeniable. There is frustration, envy, and affection, raw elements that suggest this was not merely a theological treatise, but a reflection of lived experience within a community that revered Mary Magdalene as a central figure. The male disciples' discomfort with her status likely mirrors real debates happening in early Christian groups about gender, power, and legitimacy. Who had the right to speak for Jesus? Who had truly understood him? In the Gospel of Philip, Mary emerges as a bridge between the human and divine, the material and spiritual. She represents Sophia, or divine wisdom, a recurring figure in Gnostic texts. This symbolic alignment would have reinforced her authority in the eyes of those who read these Gospels, casting her not as a sentimental figure, but as an embodiment of cosmic truth. And for the institutional church that was consolidating power in the 3rd and 4th centuries, this representation was deeply problematic. A woman bearing divine wisdom challenged the growing narrative of male apostolic succession. It undermined the hierarchy that the church needed to establish in order to align itself with imperial authority. The idea of Mary as a spiritual partner to Jesus is not just about romance. It's about a radically different model of authority, one based on relationship, mutual recognition, and the ability to receive and transmit wisdom. This model stands in stark contrast to the hierarchical, priestly structure that would come to define mainstream Christianity. If spiritual knowledge could be passed through intimacy and experience, then anyone, not just the ordained, could carry divine truth. And if a woman could receive such truth, then the barriers of gender and class meant nothing. This was a threat not only to ecclesiastical control, but to social order itself. The Gospel of Philip also hints at a theology of the body that was far more nuanced than what later Christian orthodoxy would allow. Rather than viewing flesh as sinful and women as temptresses, this text sees the physical world as a gateway to the spiritual when rightly understood. Mary's closeness to Jesus was not a temptation to be suppressed, but a channel for understanding divine mysteries. This too was buried as the Church became more aligned with Roman ideals of purity, celibacy, and control. While we may never fully know the exact nature of Jesus and Mary Magdalene's relationship, what is clear is that some early Christians believed she held a place of unparalleled intimacy and insight. The texts that survived, often in fragments, hidden for centuries, testify to a tradition that saw her not as a follower in the background, but as the disciple who grasped what the others missed. She was the one who loved and was loved, not with sentimentality, but with shared truth. And what of Peter and the others? Their resistance is telling. It shows us that authority in the early church was contested, debated, fought over. Mary's presence in these apocryphal texts is not decorative. It is central. She is not the object of love. She is its voice. Her closeness to Jesus was not the exception. It was the revelation. As we peel back the centuries of dogma and reinterpretation, the figure that emerges from the Gospel of Philip is not a myth, but a memory of a woman entrusted with something too powerful to be forgotten, too disruptive to be included, and too sacred to be ignored. She stands not beside Jesus as a passive recipient, but face to face with him as a mirror of divine truth. And in that reflection, we are asked to see not only Mary, but ourselves, the potential to know, to love, and to carry wisdom beyond boundaries drawn by fear. Beneath the surface of early Christian texts, both canonical and apocryphal, runs a quiet but unmistakable conflict. One that scholars have come to see not merely as a narrative detail, but as a reflection of a real historical struggle. It was not just about theology or doctrine, it was about power. And at the heart of that struggle stood two figures whose visions of Christian authority could not have been more different. Mary Magdalene and Peter. One represented intimate revelation, the other institutional succession. One listened in silence and received visions. The other demanded clarity, structure, and control. In many ways, their clash was a battle over what Christianity itself would become. In the Gospel of Mary, the tension is explicit. After Jesus' departure, the disciples are distraught. It is Mary who steps forward to comfort and guide them. She recounts a vision in which the soul ascends through hostile powers and finally reaches rest in the fullness of the Spirit. It is a powerful allegory of salvation, rooted in mysticism and inner knowledge. But Peter, the supposed rock of the church, is incensed. Did he really speak with a woman in private and not openly to us? He demands. The question is not just about revelation, it is about legitimacy. Peter's reaction reveals a deep discomfort. For him, the idea that Jesus would entrust a woman with secret teachings is unacceptable. His challenge is not intellectual, it is hierarchical. He cannot reconcile Mary's authority with his own claim to leadership. The problem is not the content of her vision, but that it came through her. This exchange captures the heart of what many scholars now call the apostolic conflict, a tension between rival claims to truth in the first few generations after Jesus' death. Peter represented the emerging institutional church. He is the figure most associated with apostolic succession, episcopal authority, and the early Christian move toward order and orthodoxy. His legacy, especially as interpreted by the Roman Catholic Church, is one of governance, discipline, and theological boundaries. Mary Magdalene, by contrast, represents a different kind of authority, one rooted in personal encounter, direct revelation, and spiritual insight that does not require formal validation. In this light, their clash is not petty jealousy. It is ideological. It is a fight between two models of Christianity. One would lead to cathedrals, councils, and creeds. The other pointed toward mysticism, inner transformation, and the democratization of spiritual authority. It is telling that in the texts where Mary Magdalene is given voice, Peter often seeks to silence her. And in the texts where Peter's authority is dominant, Mary is either absent or reframed as repentant and marginal. The Pistis Sophia, another Gnostic text from the same era, reinforces this dynamic. In it, Mary Magdalene asks more questions than any other disciple, nearly half of all recorded dialogue. Her insights are praised by Jesus, even as the male disciples grow impatient. At one point, Peter even complains, "Master, We cannot endure this woman, for she takes the opportunity from us and lets none of us speak. Jesus defends her, recognizing her understanding and commending her spiritual insight. The message is clear. Mary's voice is authoritative, not in spite of her gender, but because of her understanding. Yet history chose Peter. As the church aligned itself with Roman structures of power and governance, Peter's model prevailed. Apostolic succession offered a clear chain of command. Mary's revelatory wisdom did not. Her authority could not be institutionalized. It could not be handed down through ordination or preserved in liturgy. It lived only in experience, in vision, in the memory of those who honored her role. And so, she was written out. This erasure was not complete, of course. Her name remained in the Gospels. Her presence at the crucifixion and resurrection could not be undone. But her voice, the teaching Mary, the visionary Mary, the leader Mary, was buried under layers of redefinition. She became a symbol, not a source. Her authority was transformed into repentance. Her insight became emotion. And Peter, the institutional voice, became the rock. But archaeology and scholarship have brought her back into focus. We now know that early Christian communities were far more diverse than the institutional church later allowed. Some groups honored Peter, others followed James, and some venerated Mary Magdalene. Each had its own gospel, its own rituals, its own vision of who Jesus was and what he taught. The eventual dominance of Peter's model was not inevitable. It was the result of political decisions, imperial alliances, and cultural pressures that demanded order over diversity. In this context, the marginalization of Mary Magdalene was strategic. By removing her from the center, the church removed the most potent challenge to its emerging power structure. A woman who claimed direct revelation, who taught with wisdom equal to or greater than the apostles, posed a threat that could not be tolerated. The easiest way to neutralize that threat was to recast her as a sinner saved by grace rather than a leader formed by wisdom. The tragedy of this transformation is not just historical, it is spiritual. In losing Mary's voice, the church lost a vital aspect of early Christian vision. It lost the memory of a faith that honored experience over hierarchy, intimacy over institution, and spiritual equality over social convention. But the rediscovery of texts like the Gospel of Mary, the Pistis Sophia, and others has begun to restore that memory. They remind us that the early church was not uniform. It was a vibrant, contested, living community of people trying to understand the mystery they had encountered. And in that community, Mary Magdalene was not silent. She spoke, she led, and she challenged. She was not merely a witness. She was a teacher, not a repentant outsider, but a central voice. The tension between her and Peter continues to echo, not as a resolved dispute, but as an ongoing question. What kind of faith will we choose? One rooted in structure, or one rooted in spirit? That question remains unanswered. But Mary's reemergence in our time suggests that the story is not over. Her voice, once silenced, is rising again, not in opposition to Peter, but as a necessary counterpart. Together, their stories offer a fuller picture of the early Jesus movement, one marked not by certainty, but by struggle, not by conformity, but by diversity, and not by silence, but by the courage to speak, even when the world refuses to listen. The disappearance of Mary Magdalene's teachings was no accident. It was not the product of historical forgetfulness or unfortunate confusion. It was the outcome of an intentional erasure, a slow, systematic suppression of a worldview too unruly, too mystical, and far too egalitarian for the structure the Church was becoming. The deeper we dig into the early centuries of Christianity, the clearer the pattern becomes. Mary's voice was silenced because it stood for something that threatened the very logic of institutional control. The early followers of Jesus lived in an environment teeming with spiritual diversity. The 1st and 2nd centuries saw a wide array of Christian communities emerge, each interpreting Jesus' teachings through different lenses, shaped by culture, philosophy, and spiritual experience. Some emphasized tradition, others experience. Some believed authority came from apostolic succession. Others believed it came from divine insight received in the heart. It was in this chaotic, creative spiritual ecosystem that Mary Magdalene's role made perfect sense. She was a bearer of revealed knowledge, gnosis, and in many of the texts that remembered her, salvation itself was framed not as blind faith or obedience, but as awakening. This Gnostic approach to Christianity emphasized direct personal knowledge of the divine. It taught that every human soul contained a spark of the divine, trapped in the material world and needing to be liberated through understanding. In many Gnostic texts, Jesus appears not as a sacrificial lamb, but as a revealer of hidden wisdom, a teacher whose mission was to awaken people to their inner divinity. And in these texts, it is Mary Magdalene, not Peter or Paul, who is closest to grasping the depth of his message. To the emerging Orthodox Church, this was dangerous. If the divine could be accessed directly, through meditation, vision, or experience, then what role did priests serve? If wisdom came not from hierarchy but from personal transformation, then who decided what was heresy and what was truth? And if a woman could be the recipient of such wisdom, then what did that say about the patriarchal order already beginning to define Christian practice? The 4th century marked a turning point. As the Roman Empire adopted Christianity under Emperor Constantine, the faith needed to become something it had never been before: unified. The wild, pluralistic expressions of early Christianity were no longer acceptable. There had to be one Bible, one creed, one canon of saints, one chain of authority. The teachings that Mary Magdalene represented, individual revelation, visionary experience, and feminine spiritual power, did not fit into that mold, and so they were condemned as heresy. Texts like the Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Philip, Pistis Sophia, and others were declared false, not necessarily because they contradicted Jesus' ethical teachings, but because they proposed a different vision of how divine truth operated. They elevated contemplation over compliance, spirit over structure, and personal transformation over ritual. For a church growing increasingly aligned with imperial structures, these ideas were destabilizing. They could not be tolerated. The suppression came not only in word, but in physical action. Councils were convened. Gospels were banned. Manuscripts were burned. Communities that had preserved these alternative teachings, many led or influenced by women, were labeled heretical. Some were driven underground. Others were destroyed. And yet, even in the midst of this erasure, some believers could not bring themselves to destroy the sacred. Instead, they hid the manuscripts. They buried them in jars and caves, hoping that one day the wisdom might be found again. The Nag Hammadi discovery in 1945 was the result of such defiance, spiritual preservation in the face of institutional persecution. Why, then, did Mary Magdalene's teachings in particular need to be buried? The answer lies not just in what she taught, but in who she was. Her very existence disrupted the theological architecture being constructed. She was a woman, independent, financially empowered, spiritually gifted, and entrusted with revelation. She defied every norm, and her prominence in the resurrection narrative meant her memory could not be erased, so it had to be rewritten. By turning her from a revealer of divine wisdom into a repentant sinner, the Church solved a political and theological problem. They could retain her name without retaining her power. She could be venerated without being imitated. She could be honored as long as she stayed silent. This was not just a symbolic gesture. It was a message to every woman who might have imagined herself a spiritual equal. The Church had spoken. Leadership was male, authority was apostolic, and revelation came only through sanctioned channels. Yet history has a way of remembering what institutions forget. In the margins of medieval manuscripts, in underground mystical traditions, and in the oral memory of dissident communities, Mary Magdalene's deeper identity endured. She became a figure of fascination, not just because of her proximity to Jesus, but because of the power that proximity represented. A power that, for many, could not be denied forever. In recent decades, as archaeological and textual discoveries have reshaped our understanding of early Christianity, scholars have returned to Mary's story with fresh urgency. Feminist theologians, in particular, have pointed out the high cost of her erasure, not just to women, but to the spiritual imagination as a whole. By silencing Mary Magdalene, the Church also silenced a vision of Christianity that was mystical, experiential, and inclusive. The Gnostic tradition remembered her not as a rebel, but as a model, a guide for those seeking to move beyond dogma and into direct encounter with the divine. This is why her teachings were buried, not because they were false, but because they were free, because they offered a way of knowing God that could not be institutionalized, monetized, or controlled. Mary Magdalene stood for a version of Christianity that honored inner awakening over external obedience, and for those in power, that was intolerable. Yet buried truth does not decay. It waits. And as her story is rediscovered today, it speaks to a world once again hungry for spiritual authenticity. Mary's voice, once locked behind centuries of silence, now rises, not in condemnation, but in invitation. She calls us not to abandon tradition, but to remember what it once contained, to listen again for the whisper of wisdom that institutions feared, to believe that revelation still comes, not only through hierarchy, but through the heart. Centuries after Mary Magdalene's voice was officially silenced by the institutional church, her presence began to re-emerge, not in dusty theological treatises, but in the rich soil of European legend. Nowhere was this more pronounced than in the south of France, where medieval traditions claimed that Mary Magdalene herself had sailed across the Mediterranean, landing on the shores of Provence. There, they said, she preached, healed, and ultimately withdrew to a cave, where she spent the final decades of her life in solitude and mystical contemplation. The Church may have suppressed her teachings, but in the medieval imagination, Mary Magdalene had not disappeared. She had simply journeyed on. According to these French legends, Mary Magdalene arrived in Gaul with a small group of Jesus' followers, including Martha, Lazarus, and a woman known as Mary Jacob. Their boat, guided by divine providence, landed near what is now the town of Sainte-Marie-de-la-Mer. From there, Mary made her way inland to a cave in the mountains of Saint-Baume, where she lived the remainder of her life in prayer, silence, and ecstatic vision. Pilgrims eventually began to visit the site, and by the Middle Ages, it had become one of the most important Christian shrines in Europe, second only to Santiago de Compostela. To modern historians, the plausibility of this voyage is, at best, uncertain. There are no first-century sources that mention Mary Magdalene traveling to France, and the legends did not gain widespread traction until nearly 1,000 years after her death. Yet the symbolic power of the story cannot be dismissed. Whether or not Mary Magdalene physically journeyed to Provence, the legends reveal a powerful truth. The collective Christian imagination could not contain her within the role the institutional church had assigned her. People wanted more. They sensed something deeper in her story, something unfinished, something holy. The medieval French traditions offer a very different Mary Magdalene than the weeping penitent of Gregory the Great's vision. Here she is not consumed by guilt, but transformed by revelation. She teaches, she heals, she baptizes. According to some versions of the legend, she confronts pagan rulers, performs miracles, and even ascends into the heavens before her death. In this telling, she is not a warning about sin, but a model of spiritual enlightenment and courage. The cave of Saint-Baume, where Mary was said to have lived for 30 years, became a sacred site. Pilgrims trekked through forests and up steep mountain paths to reach it. Many wrote of experiencing visions or spiritual awakenings upon arrival. The cave itself is high in the cliffs, isolated and echoing with mystery. Those who stood inside described it as a place of profound stillness, where the boundary between heaven and earth felt thin. It was a perfect symbol of Mary's enduring mystique, hidden, yet powerful, forgotten by authority, but remembered by the soul. Interestingly, these legends emerged in a region that would later become associated with religious dissent. Southern France was a stronghold of the Cathars, a heretical Christian sect that the Catholic Church ultimately crushed in the 13th century. The Cathars believed in a dualistic universe, rejected the material world as corrupt, and elevated spiritual purity above ritual obedience. They also recognized the spiritual authority of women, and some Cathar communities were led by female perfects who lived ascetic lives of contemplation. While there is no direct evidence that the Cathars venerated Mary Magdalene specifically, it is telling that her legend flourished in the very landscape that gave rise to one of the most radical challenges to Catholic orthodoxy. Scholars have suggested that the French legends may preserve older, alternative Christian memories, echoes of a Mary Magdalene who was not just redeemed, but revered. Perhaps the people of Provence, knowingly or not, carried forward the ancient tradition of Mary as a teacher, a mystic, and a prophet. Perhaps the cave, the miracles, and the journey were not literal history, but spiritual metaphor, a reassertion of her voice in the only way still allowed. By the late Middle Ages, the Church could not ignore the fervent devotion to Mary Magdalene in France. The Basilica of Saint Mary Magdalene was built in Saint-Maximin-la-Sainte-Baume, and relics believed to be hers were placed inside. Pilgrimages increased. Feasts were celebrated, yet even then, the Church remained cautious. The official liturgy continued to emphasize her as a sinner saved by grace, even as local traditions insisted she was something more. Art from this period reflects the dual identity she had assumed. In some paintings, she is the penitent, clothed in hair, holding a skull, but in others, particularly in France, she appears regal, radiant, and wise. In these images, she is not kneeling in remorse, but standing in authority. A woman who has seen something others have not. A woman who bears a secret. A woman whose truth lingers, just out of reach. The legends of Mary Magdalene in France endured through centuries of political upheaval, war, and religious transformation. They survived the Protestant Reformation, the French Revolution, and even the rise of modern secularism. In the 20th and 21st centuries, interest in these stories has only grown. Writers, filmmakers, and spiritual seekers have flocked to the caves and churches of Provence, drawn not just by legend, but by the yearning for a different Christianity, one with room for feminine wisdom, mystical insight, and sacred partnership. Whether or not Mary Magdalene ever walked the hills of France, her presence there is undeniable. The stories told about her in Provence are not merely tales of the miraculous. They are acts of remembrance. They speak to the parts of the Christian tradition that refused to be erased. They suggest that beneath the layers of dogma and distortion, a deeper memory has survived. A memory of a woman who carried truth, not shame. A woman who led, not followed. A woman who, even in exile, refused to be silent. In the cave of Saint-Baume, the walls are damp with ancient breath, and the air is thick with incense and prayer. Pilgrims still climb the mountain to sit where she is said to have prayed. They light candles, they whisper their burdens, and in that place of shadow and stone, something ancient stirs. Whether myth or memory, Mary Magdalene waits. She waits not to be worshipped, but to be remembered. Not to be pitied, but to be heard. Not as a penitent, but as a prophet. A woman whose journey did not end at the tomb, but continued, across waters, through centuries, into the hearts of those who still dare to seek her voice. If Mary Magdalene had only been remembered as the first witness to the resurrection, her role in Christian tradition might have been preserved without much controversy. But the ancient texts buried in the deserts of Egypt and preserved by defiant hands tell a more unsettling story. They tell of visions, of esoteric teachings, of secret knowledge passed from Jesus to Mary alone. And in these revelations lie ideas so radical, so destabilizing to the early church's vision of order, that they had to be suppressed. These weren't prophecies in the sense of predicting wars or disasters. They were spiritual truths, revelations about the soul, salvation, the nature of the divine. And they pointed to a version of Christianity that didn't need temples or priests. It needed only awakening. And that made them dangerous. The Gospel of Mary, in particular, contains one of the most mysterious and provocative passages in early Christian literature. After Jesus departs, Mary comforts the disciples and begins to reveal the secret teachings he gave her. She describes a vision in which the soul ascends through layers of spiritual resistance, abstract powers that try to bind it to fear, ignorance, and desire. It's a deeply mystical account, one that suggests salvation is not achieved through ritual, but through knowledge, inner transformation, and overcoming the illusions of the material world. This vision was met with immediate resistance from the other disciples, particularly Peter, who demanded proof that Jesus would entrust such knowledge to a woman. It wasn't just skepticism, it was outrage. The idea that divine revelation could bypass the traditional male hierarchy was unthinkable. Mary's calm yet firm response, that she received these teachings in a vision and knew they were true because she had wept and witnessed, offers a profound contrast to Peter's defensiveness. Her authority comes not from position, but from experience, not from appointment, but from awakening. What made these teachings dangerous was not their content alone, but the implications they carried. If the divine speaks through vision, if the soul can ascend through its own journey of transformation, then what role does institutional religion play? The early church was beginning to organize itself around authority, dogma, and exclusivity. It needed structure. It needed gatekeepers. The mystical revelations associated with Mary Magdalene offered no such structure. They suggested that God could be found in the silence of the cave, in the depths of one's soul, in the broken-hearted seeker who listens more than they speak. Other Gnostic texts added to the picture. The Pistis Sophia, another esoteric gospel, portrayed Mary Magdalene as Jesus' most advanced disciple, the one who asked the best questions and understood the highest teachings. In many passages, Jesus commends her, explaining complex cosmological truths to her, while the other disciples look on in confusion. Mary is not just present. She is central. She embodies divine wisdom, often associated in these texts with the feminine figure of Sophia, spiritual insight personified. These teachings introduced a radically different cosmology. In Gnostic thought, the material world is not the pinnacle of God's creation, but a fallen realm, a place of distortion where the soul is trapped. Salvation is not about appeasing an external deity, but remembering who you are, breaking through illusion to reclaim your true divine nature. This is the kind of teaching Mary Magdalene is said to have received. It's a teaching that rejects fear-based obedience and embraces conscious awakening. Naturally, this was seen as a threat. As Christianity moved closer to the halls of Roman power, its leaders needed a faith that could unify vast populations. A mystical, fluid, gender-inclusive spirituality did not fit that vision. They needed control, and Mary's revelations, with their insistence on inner knowing, personal responsibility, and divine femininity, stood in the way. The prophecies attributed to Mary Magdalene were dangerous, not because they opposed Christ's teachings, but because they embodied them in ways that could not be controlled. In her revelations, Jesus is not the distant king demanding worship, but the teacher guiding each soul to discover the divine within. Mary's experience becomes the model, not for penance, but for transformation. Her role is not to serve, but to reveal. She becomes the new Eve, the restorer of the fallen order, not through submission, but through wisdom. This spiritual authority made her prophecies doubly subversive. First, because she was a woman, and second, because she bypassed the structures of institutional power. Her vision of Christianity was experiential, mystical, personal. And those who followed in her footsteps, many of them women mystics, poets, and prophets across the centuries, would continue to challenge the boundaries of accepted theology. Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, Teresa of Avila, all echoed the legacy of Mary's voice, even when they didn't name her. Modern scholars have taken great interest in these prophetic traditions, not to sensationalize them, but to understand the spiritual ecosystem of the early church. What they've discovered is astonishing. There were many forms of Christianity in the first few centuries, and the form that became dominant was not necessarily the most faithful to Jesus' original message. It was the one that best aligned with imperial needs. The prophecies of Mary Magdalene, in contrast, represent a Christianity of the heart, a vision in which salvation is not administered by clergy but discovered within, a worldview where feminine insight is not subordinate but essential, a revelation in which the divine is not confined to heaven but present in every soul willing to remember. As these texts have resurfaced, they've inspired a new generation of spiritual seekers, people tired of dogma, hungry for authenticity, and willing to explore the hidden corners of their tradition. Mary Magdalene's revelations are not just ancient words on crumbling parchment. They are living questions. What if the soul is more than the church says it is? What if spiritual truth is not something we receive, but something we awaken to? And what if the divine speaks to those who have been ignored the longest? In this light, Mary's role as a prophet is not about predicting the future, but revealing the eternal. Her teachings are dangerous not because they are false, but because they invite us to remember, to step outside the lines, to trust what we see in vision and silence more than what we are told from the pulpit. She does not promise easy answers. She invites us into mystery, and in doing so, she reminds us why her voice was buried and why it refuses to stay silent. The suppression of Mary Magdalene's voice did not happen in a single moment, nor was it the result of one man's decision. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, over centuries. A systematic process that involved theology, politics, and power. Her teachings, her authority, and her memory were not only buried beneath the weight of doctrine, but intentionally reshaped to serve the needs of an emerging religious empire. The church didn't just forget Mary Magdalene's role, it replaced it with a version of her that was easier to control. And in doing so, it rewrote one of the most foundational elements of its own story. After the resurrection narratives, Mary Magdalene's name fades from the canonical texts. There are no letters from her, no detailed biographies, no epistles bearing her voice. This silence gave space for others to redefine her legacy. As the church struggled to form a unified doctrine, Mary became a pawn in the effort to reinforce ecclesiastical hierarchy. Her presence as the first witness of the resurrection was acknowledged but reframed, less as an authoritative act and more as a moment of redemption. A woman saved from her past, not a teacher shaping the future. The pivotal moment in this process came with Pope Gregory the Great's sermon in 591 CE. In front of a Roman congregation, Gregory declared that Mary Magdalene was the same woman as both Mary of Bethany and the anonymous sinful woman in Luke's Gospel. The logic was flimsy. The identities were clearly distinct in the texts. But this interpretation served a powerful purpose. It turned a female apostle into a reformed sinner. It shifted the image of Mary from teacher to penitent. The church could then praise her for her devotion without endorsing her authority. She became a model of repentance, not revelation. The image caught fire. Medieval sermons, plays, paintings, and poems began to reflect this newly formed identity. Artists painted her with loose hair and tear-streaked faces, kneeling in caves with skulls and crosses. The Magdalene became a symbol of brokenness and forgiveness, often eroticized and pitied. In this rebranding, the Church had its perfect female saint, passionate, emotional, and submissive. What had been lost was her voice, the woman who stood at the center of the resurrection, who challenged Peter, who interpreted visions, who taught hidden wisdom. As the Church consolidated power in the 4th and 5th centuries, councils were convened to define orthodoxy. Doctrines were codified. Canon was closed. In this rigid framework, there was no place for Mary's alternative gospels. The Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the Pistis Sophia, all were deemed heretical, not because they lacked spiritual insight, but because they presented a Christianity that was mystical, pluralistic, and inclusive. They challenged apostolic authority, questioned the necessity of intermediaries, and in many cases, elevated female voices. The Church's response was swift and brutal. These texts were banned, their communities persecuted, their memory erased. In the East, the story was different. The Orthodox Church never fully adopted the Western narrative of Mary as a prostitute. They retained her title as equal to the apostles and honored her feast day accordingly. Icons depicted her as dignified, robed in red, holding the resurrection egg, a symbol of rebirth and divine truth. While not immune to patriarchal influence, the Eastern tradition preserved more of her original status. It is a reminder that even within Christianity, the suppression of Mary Magdalene's legacy was not inevitable. It was a choice, cultural, political, and theological. The Reformation brought new scrutiny to traditional Catholic teachings. Protestant leaders rejected the cult of saints and questioned the validity of Mary's conflation with the sinful woman. Yet even here, old habits lingered. Though stripped of saintly intercession, Mary Magdalene's image remained steeped in sexualized repentance. She was still the fallen woman, not the wise teacher. Protestantism, despite its revolutionary zeal, did little to recover her authentic voice. It wasn't until the rise of historical critical scholarship in the 18th and 19th centuries that serious questions began to be asked. Academics began examining early Christian texts with new methods: literary analysis, archaeology, linguistics. They noticed discrepancies, silences, and contradictions. They rediscovered buried manuscripts. They translated long-forgotten gospels, and slowly, a new picture began to emerge. One where Mary was not defined by sin, but by vision. Not by emotion, but by spiritual authority. The 20th century brought a seismic shift. The discovery of the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945 gave scholars access to an entire body of writings that had been hidden for centuries. Suddenly, Mary Magdalene's voice was heard again, in the Gospel of Mary, in the dialogue of the Savior, in mystical passages where she speaks with clarity, power, and insight. These were not fabrications or forgeries. They were early Christian texts, copied and preserved by communities whose faith had survived outside the official channels of the Church. Faced with mounting evidence, the Catholic Church slowly began to revise its stance. In 1969, the Vatican quietly removed the label of penitent prostitute from the official liturgical calendar. In 2016, Pope Francis elevated her Memorial Day to a full feast day, placing her, at least symbolically, on the same level as the male apostles. The gesture was historic, but it fell short of full acknowledgement. There was still no formal recognition of her as a theological authority, or of the role her voice played in shaping early Christian thought. Today, Her image is undergoing a radical recovery. Scholars, theologians, and spiritual seekers alike are revisiting her legacy. Feminist theology, in particular, has reclaimed Mary Magdalene as a foundational figure, a symbol of suppressed wisdom, lost voices, and the sacred feminine. She has become a bridge between ancient memory and modern awakening, a figure whose erasure tells us as much about what was feared as what was believed. Her long suppression was never just about her. It was about controlling access to the divine. It was about gatekeeping revelation, defining authority, and silencing those who stood outside the lines. Mary Magdalene, in all her complexity, represented a version of Christianity that was more intimate, more experiential, and more equal than the one codified in councils and catechisms. But buried voices have a way of rising. Her story, once silenced, now speaks again, not only from ancient manuscripts, but from hearts across the world who recognize her wisdom, her strength, and her truth. For centuries, the truth about Mary Magdalene lay buried beneath sands, beneath doctrine, beneath centuries of silence. Her voice, once vibrant and central, had been fractured into fragments of myth, slander, and half-remembered legend. But truth has a strange persistence. It waits. And when the world is ready, it returns. In our own time, Mary Magdalene has re-emerged, not just as a misunderstood biblical figure, but as a symbol of suppressed wisdom, spiritual courage, and the power of remembering what was once forbidden to speak. The modern rediscovery of Mary Magdalene's authentic role is not merely an academic curiosity. It is a profound shift in how we understand early Christianity. It reveals a world in which women were not merely followers, but founders. Not just witnesses, but teachers. A world where divine wisdom could flow through anyone. Not just the ordained, not just the male, not just the chosen few. In recovering Mary's voice, we begin to recover something deeper. The buried diversity, mysticism, and freedom that once characterized the Jesus movement before it became a religious empire. This recovery has come through many channels. Archaeology has unearthed sacred texts. Scholars have retranslated and reinterpreted manuscripts once labeled heretical. Feminist theologians have questioned long-held assumptions, asking why certain stories were preserved and others erased. Artists, poets, mystics, and spiritual seekers have all contributed to a rising chorus that refuses to let the old silences stand unchallenged. And what they've found is astonishing. Mary Magdalene was never a prostitute. She was never condemned by Jesus. She was never demoted by him. Her demotion came later, by men who felt threatened by what she represented. She was the first to witness the resurrection, the first to speak the good news, the first to be sent. That alone demands a rethinking of everything that followed. But her story is more than historical correction. It is spiritual renewal. The ancient texts show her not only as a witness, but as a visionary. She saw beyond death. She saw the path of the soul. She understood that salvation was not a transaction, but a transformation. Her teachings, preserved in texts like the Gospel of Mary and the Pistis Sophia, reveal a path of awakening, one that does not rely on fear, shame, or obedience, but on love, memory, and inner knowing. This is what makes her so dangerous to institutions, not because she contradicts Jesus, but because she embodies him. She does not speak about dogma. She speaks about direct experience. Her God is not distant and wrathful, but intimate and alive. Her path is not about conformity, but about courage. The courage to remember who we truly are beneath the masks and roles we've been given. In a world still struggling with the same questions about gender, authority, spiritual power, Mary Magdalene has become a mirror. What do we fear in her story? Is it her closeness to Jesus, her leadership, her refusal to remain silent? Or is it something even more radical? The idea that divine truth doesn't belong to institutions at all, but to the awakened heart. Her legacy has been reclaimed not only by scholars but by those at the margins. Women who felt unseen, mystics who found no home in churches, seekers who could no longer accept a religion that demanded silence instead of inquiry. For them, Mary is not just a figure of the past. She is a guide, a presence, a whisper that says, "There is more. Come and see." In this reclaiming, we also confront an uncomfortable truth. The history of Christianity, like all history, has been written by those in power. Voices like Mary Magdalene's were not lost. They were pushed aside. The fact that her story could be rewritten so thoroughly, so successfully, for so long, should make us pause. What other truths have been buried? What other prophets have we ignored? What revelations were lost because they came in the wrong voice, the wrong gender, the wrong time? But there is hope in this too, because if her voice could survive, hidden in caves, whispered in stories, recovered in scholarship, then perhaps truth itself cannot be destroyed. It can be silenced. It can be distorted. But not forever. The truth about Mary Magdalene did not die. It waited. And now, it speaks again. Today, more people than ever are reading the texts she inspired. They are walking the paths she once walked. They are standing in the caves where she was said to have prayed. They are looking not for legends, but for a deeper connection to the sacred, to themselves, to a spiritual lineage that includes voices like hers. Not perfect, not convenient, but real. Her resurrection is not just about memory, it is about transformation. As we recover her story, we are invited to recover our own, to question what we've accepted, to trust our own experiences, to reclaim the authority that resides not in titles or traditions, but in the soul's encounter with the divine. The story of Mary Magdalene is not just the story of a woman wrongly accused. It is the story of how power rewrites history. It is the story of how courage remembers it. And it is the story of how, even in the darkest chapters, light finds a way through. We now know that early Christianity was far more diverse than once imagined. There was never just one gospel, one interpretation, one church. There were many voices, many paths, and among them, Mary's was one of the most powerful. That voice is still speaking, not in condemnation, but in invitation. She is not calling us to rebel. She is calling us to remember the teacher who trusted her, the message she carried, the wisdom she preserved, and the truth that was too dangerous to survive, except it did. In remembering Mary Magdalene, we do not abandon the church. We expand it. We do not discard tradition. We enrich it. We do not reject faith. We deepen it. Her story doesn't diminish Christianity. It restores it to its original complexity, its wild inclusivity, and its untamed spirit. The forbidden truth is no longer forbidden. It is here. It is in the manuscripts, in the art, in the cave, in the scholar's words, in your heart. And it asks one simple question. Now that you know, what will you do with the truth?